Hi everyone, this is Kevin Wagner, the Keto Advocate. In January of 2016, I had the privilege to sit down and chat with Dr. Mary Newport at the first annual conference on nutritional ketosis and metabolic therapeutics held in Tampa, Florida. Let's see what Dr. Newport had to say.
Yes, I am Dr. Mary Newport. I'm a physician. I am a neonatologist by training, and I practiced in newborn intensive care units for 30 years in Florida. I became interested in Alzheimer's disease because my husband developed it when he was very young, only 51 years old, and I became his primary caregiver and, of course, was very interested in trying to find anything I could to help him. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about a dietary intervention for Alzheimer's. It's medium-chain triglycerides and ketones as alternative fuel for the brain in Alzheimer's disease. Well, probably my biggest study was just a study of one person, my husband, originally. So it wasn't a scientific study per se, but it has been published as a case report in Alzheimer's and Dementia Journal. My husband was about to participate or screened for 2 clinical trials on days back to back. And I got on the internet and I was looking at the 2 drugs which were both aimed at either removing or preventing further accumulation of beta amyloid plaque in the brain, which is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. I was looking for the risks and the benefits of these 2 drugs, and I happened upon a press release about a medical food that improved the memories of people with Alzheimer's in about half of the subjects. And this was a medical food that was aiming towards FDA approval. It was still about a year out, though, from being available. The press release didn't say what it was or what it did, how it worked. So I became curious about it, and I was able to find their patent application. And I learned that what the target was the problem of diabetes of the brain in Alzheimer's, which was a new idea to me, and that this medical food potentially could bypass this problem of diabetes of the brain to provide fuel for the brain in people with Alzheimer's, and that's how they believed it worked. And the reason it made sense to me or was familiar to me was because it was medium-chain triglyceride oil. And I was familiar with that because I'm a neonatologist. We used it in the late 70s and early 80s for our premature newborns. We would add it to each of their feedings to help them gain weight. And then the formula manufacturers started adding it to infant formulas. And also, human breast milk contains medium-chain fatty acids. It's really the only instance in which humans make medium-chain fatty acids is to provide nutrition to their newborns. So this was familiar to me because I'm a neonatologist. So it was a very lucky, fortunate happenstance that I came across this online. And one of the things I learned is, that Alzheimer's is a type of diabetes of the brain. There's insulin resistance and insulin deficiency in certain parts of the brain that progress as a person, goes through the various stages of Alzheimer's. And effectively, it means that there is difficulty getting glucose into brain cells. And the brain cells malfunction, and it is believed that ultimately they will die, from lack of fuel. That is why we see the symptoms that we see in Alzheimer's disease. It follows a very specific pathway through the brain in most instances. So this idea of using medium-chain triglyceride oil is potentially beneficial because when you ingest this type of oil, your liver converts part of it to ketones, and ketones are an alternative fuel for the brain that do not require insulin to get into the brain cells and very easily cross the blood-brain barrier. And in fact, our evolution, is possible most likely because we are able to take fat when we've run out of glucose stores in our body and convert part of it to ketones, which our brain can use as alternative fuel when there's no glucose. So, the brain can very easily switch over from using glucose to ketones. So this idea was intriguing to me, and one of the things I learned in the patent application was that MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil, is extracted from coconut oil. And that was news to me. And but it was about 1 a.m. and I'm reading about all of this, and my husband was set up for a screening at 9 a.m. in the morning. So we went on to the screening, and he did not do well. He met all the criteria for getting into the clinical trial, except that he had a mini mental status exam score of only 14 out of 30, and he needed at least 16 to get into the trial. So we were extremely disappointed about that. And on the way home, I thought, what do we have to lose? I'm going to go pick up some coconut oil, which seemed a little ludicrous at the time. But when I got home, I started looking up online, reminding myself 101 biochemistry, what are the medium chain triglycerides? What are the short chain? What are the long chain? I started reading about them, reading about ketones. And I was able to find the fatty acid composition from a government website of coconut oil, and I learned that it is almost 60%, at 60% medium chain triglycerides. So from that, I used that to calculate what equivalent amount of coconut oil you might use to equal a dose of this medical food that was going to be coming out in a year to give my husband. And I found that it was about 35 grams, which is a little. The next morning, his screening was at 1 p.m. So I thought to give it a few hours, I would give this to him for breakfast. So I gave him a little over 2 tablespoons. I put it in oatmeal because coconut oil is semi-solid at room temperature. And I took the same amount. I got indigestion from it because I had never taken coconut oil before. But he did very well with it. He seemed on the way to the screening that he wasn't going to remember, some of the things, such as what is the day of the week. We were talking about that. What is the season? He couldn't even come up with the word spring. It just didn't look like much was going to happen. However, when we got to it was the Burt Alzheimer Institute for the screening, he took him away, and he came back, and he didn't think he had done very well, but a nurse came in and started talking about drawing blood and taking his blood pressure, and I said, what's going on? And she said, well, didn't he tell you he scored an 18 and he qualified for the study? And I'm like, wow. So I was, we were astounded and very grateful and ecstatic, that he was going to get into a clinical trial. But I didn't know if we just got very lucky that day, or if it was really the coconut oil. And the things he improved on, they showed me the MMSE test. He actually remembered that it was spring. He remembered the day of the week. He remembered what floor he was on where he was, what town he was in. And those were things that he couldn't remember the day before when he screened for the other, clinical trial. So we decided, well, we're going to keep this going. So, right away, you can imagine day and night I'm on the internet learning everything I can about coconut oil and ketones and MCT oil. And so we started, in addition to a measured dose at breakfast of 35 grams or a little over 2 tablespoons, started cooking with it and started getting things like coconut milk and just, I thought if one dose would be helpful, why wouldn't you continue using it throughout the day? And the studies with the medical food that's now called Axona, they had a peak level of ketones after about 90 minutes. And we learned about 6 weeks later that his level after taking coconut oil peaked at about 3 hours, and there was still a little residual 6 or 7 hours later, slight level of ketones. Whereas after he took just straight MCT oil, the one that is in Axona, his level peaked at 90 minutes and there were no ketones measurable after 3 hours. And I thought, what do you do the other 21 hours of the day, and it seemed that if, your brain needs fuel, that you should try to supply it, 24/7. So, and at this point I had a lot of contact by phone with Dr. Richard Beech of the NIH, and he is one of the world experts on ketones, and he was astounded that something like coconut oil or even MCT oil could, which has relatively low levels of ketones, could actually bring about improvement in somebody with Alzheimer's disease. But he was convinced that maybe there was something to this when Steve drew a clock, 2 weeks out, the day that he did not get into the clinical trial before he started coconut oil, the doctor had asked him to draw a clock. And he just drew a few random circles and 4 numbers. It didn't look anything like a clock, and the doctor had told me he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's based on this clock. 2 weeks later, he drew a clock that was a full circle, all the numbers in order around it. It had multiple spokes going through it. I think those were numerous hands of the clock, but it was so much more complex and so much more organized than it had been, just the day before starting coconut oil. So I faxed these to Dr. Richard Beech, and he was just amazed. And that's when he started taking notice of it. And he had people like Dr. George Cahill, who had discovered that the brain uses ketones as a fuel during starvation. And Dr. Theodore Ban, who had discovered that medium-chain triglycerides are taken up by the liver and converted to ketones. They were all calling me because they had a theory that this concept of using ketones could help somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And now here was a man who had benefited from it. And not only did he have improvements in cognition, but he said himself that he felt like the light bulb came on, the light switch came on, and that the fog lifted. He said that the very first day that he took coconut oil, and he told me that many times after. His personality came back and sense of humor came out. He had more energy. He had been very sluggish, coming out to the kitchen in the morning, not really making much conversation. He couldn't find utensils from the drawer, and just a very, very poor short-term memory. And we saw that start to improve fairly immediately. And he had tremors in his jaw. When he would try to talk, he would get caught in the middle of a sentence, and his jaw would start to tremor, and then he couldn't finish the sentence, and that was his typical speech. And that resolved completely almost right away. He had a hand tremor that when he would eat, he would have trouble getting things like rice or vegetables up to his mouth, and he had taken to using a big spoon to do that. The tremor, we would only see it occasionally before he had his coconut oil in the morning, and usually after 20 or 30 minutes, that would resolve, and then he'd have the tremor. We wouldn't see it. He had a gait disturbance where he could no longer run, and he would pick up his feet kind of higher than normal, walk slowly, and we saw that go away after about 2 or 3 months, where he was able to just walk normally and start running again. He wasn't running for exercise, but he could just pick up his feet and run. And he had a visual disturbance that had prevented him from reading for about 1.5 years. He couldn't explain to me why he had stopped reading. I figured it was comprehension, but about 3 to 4 months out from starting coconut oil, he said, "Oh, I can read again." And he said that what was happening was the words were going into little pixels. He called them pixels on the page, and they would move around, and that's why he couldn't read. And that stopped after 3 or 4 months, and that never did come back, as far as we could tell. And his conversational skills improved. He started recognizing and being able to name family members by name that he hadn't a year earlier. There was just an incredible amount of improvement, and at 9 or 10 months out, his reading comprehension improved. He, just as an example, and his memory for what he had read several hours earlier. I had a doctor appointment, and he was out in the waiting room while I was in there, and about 3 or 4 hours later, he told me, while I was in the waiting room, I read in Scientific American an article about Einstein. He told me all about it, and I'm like, what? He couldn't remember when we were gardening if he was digging a hole or filling it back up again before he started coconut oil. And here now he could remember several hours later what he had read. So that was rather amazing, and we saw improvement over really the first year, and then stabilization, for a time after that. So basically, there was a lot of documentation too during that time. He actually did get into a clinical trial, and his mini mental status score got as high as 20 about 2 months after the coconut oil, and he had actually had a low of 12. It was 12 2 weeks before that, that he screened for that clinical trial. We had been told to bring him back and try again. So it went from a low of 12 to 20 over about a 2-month period, which is very significant improvement, in somebody with Alzheimer's. So he entered a clinical trial. It was for semaglutide, which is an oral medication that helps reduce further buildup of beta amyloid plaque in the brain. And we found out later that he was on the placebo for the first 12 to 14 months. And that was a good thing for our study of sorts, our study of one person, because he had quite a bit of cognitive testing during that time. And what we saw, there's a test called the Alzheimer's Disease Assessment Scale, cognitive. It's a 75-point test. And over that first year, his score improved by 6 points, whereas later when the information was published, people on placebo dropped by 6 points. They decreased by 6 points during that time frame. And there's another test called the Activities of Daily Living that both the patient and the caregiver get input on, and his score improved by 14 out of 78 points, during that year, which is really quite amazing, for somebody with Alzheimer's. And, we could just see him functioning better and able to do things more easily during that time. So, unfortunately, after 12 or 14 months, he crossed over to the drug, which is one of the reasons we chose that study, because we knew he would eventually be on the drug if he wasn't in the beginning. And he was on it for probably 5 to 7 months. They never did give us an exact date of the crossover, but he started having side effects from it. Unusual bleeding, abrasions that wouldn't heal for a month or longer, very strange things, and he fainted, and a test called CPK, an enzyme, became very elevated that could have been cardiac, muscle, or brain. So we decided to discontinue the study at that point. And a few months later, we were advised that the study had been stopped because semaglutide, they found, caused accelerated worsening of Alzheimer's disease. So he had exposure to that drug. And, the irony is, that coconut oil helped him improve him so much that he got into the study, and then ultimately it was for a drug that may have caused more harm, probably did cause more harm than good. But so, at that point, we did start seeing some problems again. But then Dr. Richard Beech, he has been developing a ketone ester since the 1990s. And he's gone through at least a dozen different formulations of it. And he had settled on one that he felt would be beneficial. And this one was also moving towards FDA approval and had passed toxicity testing, and it was approved for use in healthy adults, recognized, So when Steve began to deteriorate, and this is close to 2 years out from starting coconut oil, he offered to do another little pilot study of one person, this time providing ketone ester for Steve. And what had happened, in addition to the semaglutide, Steve's father had passed away. And his depression, which had lifted, returned, and he started having some odd things happen, like he would have trouble picking clothes out of the closet. He'd put clothes on backwards. I had started having to talk him through things like shaving and showering, and so and he, one day he looked in the mirror. He was standing next to me, and he said, this is the strangest thing. He said, from the neck down, it looks like me. Those are my clothes, but from the neck up, it's not me. And I thought, wow, that is really strange. So he started getting some disturbances when he would look in a mirror. And so Dr. Beech, he had felt it was time to try this with somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And so he started supplying us with his ketone ester. And the very first dose, I have a videotape of Steve that's probably about 40 minutes long or so. And Steve became very energetic and euphoric. But the interesting thing was that he had not been able to write out the alphabet. He could barely, with this deterioration, write out any words. But he, for 20 minutes, sat there and over attempted to write out the alphabet, saying it while he was, and then finally he did. And he finished it, and he was ecstatic. And during that time, he talked about how poor his penmanship was, and he blamed it on his first grade teacher by name. And things like that happened, and at the end of it, he talked about how happy he was that he felt better already. He could feel a difference, and what we saw within the next 24, 48 hours is that he could pick the clothes out of the closet, put them on normally. He could take a shower, shave, things like that. Just started coming back, very quickly, and we got another probably 20 months of stability before he had a setback. So that is basically my study of one person with effective ketones as alternative fuel. About 2 weeks after Steve started improving, I felt like this was a really big secret that millions of people around the world needed to know. So I felt compelled to be a messenger, to get this information out. I didn't feel people should have to wait another year for a medical food that was going to be a prescription and very expensive when there was something on the shelf that could potentially help. And medium chain triglyceride oil is also available over the counter. It has been for a long time, and bodybuilders have used it for many years. It's been used in Japan for 20 years for weight loss. So it's, and the newborns I talked about, to help them gain weight in infant formulas. So it's been around for a long time, and so I felt like, I needed to get this message out, and I started writing to politicians and media people and not really getting any response. And, I was trying to basically tell them, it's like Alzheimer's Association, this medical food, what is in this medical food is on the shelf. My husband, I know, is only one person, but if he responds, other people will respond. The studies that the other group had done, almost half the people had a positive response to it. This needs to be studied urgently, get your medical people on this, tell the whole world about it, But I really got no response, and so I wrote up an article about it that I just started sending out online and distributing at health food stores in our area, and eventually it got picked up by the St. Petersburg Times. They ran a story on it, and then the message started getting out there. And so I started hearing back from people then. And so, again, it's not really a scientific study, but I've presented as poster presentations a couple of times. I've heard now from over 400 people that have tried this and decided to report results to me about using coconut oil or MCT oil or Axona after it came out, and about, and I think people are more likely to email me if they've had a response. That's why I consider it not a scientific study. I don't prompt them, I just tell them, what kind of improvements did you see, or did you see any improvement, and if you did, what kind of improvements did you see? And just let them tell me, rather than me prompting them, did you see this, did you see this, did you see this? So I put together a collection of 184 at a certain point a couple of years ago, and like 91% of them had reported an improvement, and another 3% reported stabilization over 6 months if they hadn't seen any decline during 6 months of doing coconut or MCT oil. And there were 6% of people that said they saw absolutely no response. About 60% have reported some type of improvement in memory or cognition, and about 40% in social interaction, improvement in mood, decrease in behavioral disturbances. So that's the kind of thing, that I heard back, so many people that made the effort to contact me, to let me know that their person had responded too. Sometimes it was the person themselves, who was now able to write to me and tell me, that they had had an improvement. So that's, it's not technically a study, funded by some organization, but information out there. It varied a lot it was about 5 years that he was getting it, and sometimes there was no supply. At the end of the fiscal year, Dr. Beech's funds would run out to even make any of it. So we would have gaps of 2 or 3 months at times. I would often take what supply we had and just greatly reduce the dose he was getting and stretch it out as long as possible, hoping we would get to October 1st, when he would get funded again. But, basically, when he had a good supply of it, he would get somewhere around 80 grams a day. Dr. Beech thinks 150 grams a day would be ideal. He just didn't have enough to be able to supply that. And but we saw a very significant improvement and sustained improvement, for 20 months, probably getting on average about 75 or 80 grams a day. And then, we had other times where we only had 25 or 50, and we would see a little decline when that happened. And when he didn't have any, we would see a significant decline slowly over 2 or 3 months that we didn't have it available.
Did he continue using the coconut oil and MCT oil?
Yeah, he did. So at some point, the levels probably just weren't high enough to sustain him, given whatever insult had happened to his brain. My feeling is we got at least 3 good extra years that were better than the year before he started the coconut oil, out of it. And, then things happened that really had, effects of medication that caused setbacks. He started having seizures. He just one day fell straight back, hit his head on the tile, and had a horrendous seizure. And, that really was kind of the beginning of the end. I think, most people, when you read about seizures and Alzheimer's, they happen during the last 6 months in the later stages. So we were expecting that we wouldn't have him around much longer, but he lasted another 2.5 years. And I think a lot of it had to do with, having ketones available and very healthy, low-carb diet, a lot of vegetables. He was willing to chew and swallow a whole plate of vegetables. And, so we just tried to give him a very healthy diet and, maintain ketosis. And it really, I think, got him through for quite a long time.
What was the macronutrient profile and percentages he was taking?
Well, it was, his carbohydrate intake was probably under 50 grams, probably even lower than that most of the time. Because of the amount of coconut and MCT oil in his diet, that probably represented, I'd say 60 or 70% of his diet at least. And protein, eggs is really probably the most perfect protein of any animal source that you can get. So he would get lots of eggs, 3 to 5 eggs a day. His cholesterol did not go sky high. He had a beautiful HDL cholesterol. Physically, he was in fantastic shape. It's just, when you have somebody like that and then they have Alzheimer's disease, it's heartbreaking. And, he maintained his weight very well, and unfortunately, Alzheimer's won the battle.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there are actually a couple studies going on. The Bird Institute locally is doing a study that was inspired by our, study with Steve and some of the case reports that I got from other people. They're studying a combination of coconut and MCT oil in people with Alzheimer's. So that study is in progress now. I am not aware of preliminary data coming out of it yet. There are groups in Japan that are studying this, other areas of the world, where they're doing relatively small studies. There's another, it's not a medical food, it's a supplement that's available just over the counter called Fuel for Thought, and it's another mixture of coconut and MCT oil. It's actually the one they're using at the Bird Institute to do their study. And they've done several studies, small studies in various clinics, looking for improvement and seeing it in the small studies that they've done in Alzheimer's and also in Parkinson's disease. That particular company, the Dr. Van Italy, who is now 96, and he discovered that medium chain or converted to ketones, had spearheaded the development of this product. And so he has a friend with Parkinson's that had an amazing response to coconut and MCT oil, with a much marked improvement in his balance. And he had been drooling, and he stopped drooling. He was actually able to start skiing again, and this was sustained for several years. So he's very interested, and they're studying Parkinson's too, and some small studies. Of course, I would like to see large-scale studies of it, and the most important thing is the ketone ester that Dr. Beech has. When I first talked to him in 2008 about it, he was frustrated because the NIH, where he has worked for decades, was not coming through with funding for clinical trials for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, much less mass production of it so that they can do these studies. He was basically limited to what he could make in his lab, which would take care of 1 or 2 people a week, Steve being the beneficiary of that. And, you know, they had enough to do their animal studies and other things that they were doing. But, you know, he has been looking for funding since 2008, which what he estimates would be about $15 million to do a large study in people with Alzheimer's disease. And so far it has not been forthcoming. So that is a study that needs to be done, and you know, that I hope will be done very soon. It has been approved for use as a food in people who are healthy for 5 days. That's what the FDA, what they you know, gave recognition of it for. So one thing that might happen that they're looking at is putting it out as a drink, you know, an energy drink of sorts for performance enhancement, but you know, potentially people, you know, with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, you know, could consider, you know, trying this themselves and see if they have an effect. So, you know, that's something that may be coming down the pike. It's an, you know, the ideal thing would be to fund clinical trials because, again, you know, you want to, you know, we found it safe in my husband, but he is one person. So is it safe? Will it be safe for most people? And the only way you find that out is through a clinical trial, and those things need to be funded. So that's probably the #1 study that I would like to see happen.